Good morning. Imagine with me, it's a time before COVID or maybe long after it's over, and you've been invited to an event. It's at a location with people and about a topic that you really don't know anything about. As you walk into this room, you look left and then you look right and you scan the horizon for anything that might give you any clue about what to expect, whom you might meet, or what could be enjoyable or intimidating. You are dressed for a formal event because that's how you read the invitation. But when you arrive, everyone is dressed completely casually. You haven't had anything to eat since noon, and it's now 7 p.m. because something in the invitation made you assume there was going to be a multi-course meal served. But rather, there are chairs set up in groups of 7, and the only thing food and drink related that you can even see is a bar, not stocked with what you might expect with alcohol, but with exotic juices. Now, if all of that isn't surprising enough, you quickly realize that everyone had been speaking a language you don't understand until they saw you. Now everyone is quiet and every eye is on you. That made me think of what Erebus shared earlier. What do you feel at that point? I suspect that you'd feel anything ranging from intrigued to confused to extremely uncomfortable, even to feeling absolutely out of place, like you don't belong. And for me, this would have been the epitome of a social nightmare. But for some of you, it might be just the social challenge that you've been looking for and missing in all of your safe encounters. What is belonging? Does it matter if you belong or not? What if you felt like you didn't belong most of the spaces in which you needed to occupy? Community, school, work, neighborhood, even in your family. What if you were treated like an outsider or even unwanted in the places where you long to belong? Last month, esteemed professor and award-winning author Ta-Nehisi Coates spoke with UC Santa Barbara professor Dr. Terrence Wooten about, among other things, belonging and home. Since this interview took place right after the events that happened on January 6th at the U.S. Capitol, Coates spoke passionately about watching this riot on national television, realizing that these rioters felt as if they belonged in the people's house. Black people, he said, couldn't even imagine feeling that at home, even to venture thinking about something like that. He said, Black people do not have home, even though they are allowed to live somewhere. Not everywhere, but in certain places until someone decides they needed to move on. So these are some of the thoughts that I brought with me to this text that Roger and Chad and Vicky read as a reader's theater. And thank you so much for bringing that text to life this morning. There is a question of territory. Jesus and his disciples were in Samaritan territory, finding themselves at a community well. Now, choosing a public location almost guarantees that you'll meet someone. But Jesus' disciples had gone in search of some food. And so Jesus was alone when a Samaritan woman approaches him. Now what? Did Jesus, being a Jewish man, belong here? Did she, a Samaritan woman who, because of personal circumstances, felt inferior, did she belong here? Jesus begins the dialogue with a request. Actually, it's a provocative command. Give me a drink. Immediately, the woman introduces a matter of class or structure. She could have asked, "What are you doing here in my territory?" which would have been legitimate. But she cuts to the chase and she says, "You're a Jew, I'm a Samaritan. We're not even supposed to talk to each other, and you've got the gall to speak to me and to ask me about something, to ask me for a favor when you shouldn't even be here?" Quickly, the conversation goes deeper. Jesus had a way of making normal, everyday occurrences into profound experiences. The woman, defensive at first, is wondering about a bucket and about how they would draw the water. So she's worried about logistics. And he's talking about something far beyond quenching his thirst, to describing an abundant, belonging, embracing life available to everyone. Now, if you think that's a far-fetched leap, you might want to read the story again. But speaking of belonging, did he even belong there? If belonging has something to do with location or territory, this text begs this question: was Jesus out of his territory? Seems like he was, at least according to the norms of those days. Why did Jesus go to where he didn't belong? If belonging is a matter of family, didn't they both belong? Both of them claimed Leah and Rachel and Jacob as their ancestors, but there have been schisms, fights, and factions throughout history, defining who was in and who was out, and ultimately causing a hostile line of division between Jews and Samaritans, internally and interpersonally, as well as geographically. Now, don't Israelis and Palestinians also claim the same ancestry, harking back to Abraham or Ibrahim? So who belongs here, where we live, on this land, in our neighborhoods? The land acknowledgement at the beginning of our service stated our recognition of a past that extends into and lives embedded within our DNA right to this very day. This acknowledgement says, as we commit to making amends for a colonizing past and the genocide of indigenous people, we gather today to respect, honor, and acknowledge the land we stand upon as Yoket land. It's a moving and multifaceted statement in which we confess the egregious wrongs that were committed against those who belonged here. In the same breath, we acknowledge that people of white European descent came in with hostile force to take what was not theirs to take. There are at least, I think at least, two acknowledgments here as I see it. Acknowledging on the one hand and honoring the land and the original inhabitants of that land, and acknowledging that the method of land transfer was violent colonization and genocide, for which amends are needed. Do every one of us fit into those categories? That's something to ponder and come to grips with in the coming weeks and months. The map that you see comes from Armin Don Manassian's thesis and was shared by Dr. Nathan Hensley at a recent Interfaith Scholars session right here in Fresno. Some of you may know Dr. Hensley. He's a Fresno native, and now he's the Associate Professor of English in Georgetown University. Last summer, he wrote a well-researched essay entitled Remapping White Childhood on Fresno Redlining. Andrew File, Executive Director of Fresno not-for-profit Every Neighborhood Partnership, with whom we also have partnered in community initiatives, writes, and I quote, Why is Fresno so divided? It is in our bones. Here is the restrictive covenant that was in place in my neighborhood, not to sell or lease said property or any part thereof, nor to convey by deed or otherwise any portion of said property except to persons belonging to the Caucasian race. And agree not to sell, lease, or convey, or otherwise dispose of the whole or of any portion of said property to any person born in the Turkish Empire, nor to any lineal descendant of such person or persons, nor shall any person or persons other than those of the Caucasian race be permitted to occupy said property, end quote. While this is not a current map, and this particular map highlights only one ethnic group, the statement makes a statement about all non-whites. The reality of this kind of whites-only conviction lives on. Today, this ingrained attitude may be expressed in lower house appraisals for homes owned by Black families. And that's a well-documented fact all the way from the east to the west coasts of this country. In Fresno, about a quarter of Black residents are homeowners, about 25%, compared to 66% of white population. Our CUC members have stories of their own in which they have received messages in the community that they don't belong, or that they most certainly must have done something illegal to get to where they are. Something that is embedded this deeply is not simply lifted off like a blanket from a mattress, thus changing from one day to the next, not even from one generation to the next. It has taken multiple generations, layer upon layer, one restriction after the other, turning a blind eye over and over again for this to become a strong, resilient, almost impenetrable barrier of division. Jesus went boldly into territory where he didn't belong. But notice how he shows up there. He would likely have been seen as the one with the power in that situation. Notice how he interacts. He is alone when he asks the woman for water, rather than speaking out of a group of a dozen men or so. He is sitting down, which is a less controlling posture than approaching her standing up. He asks her for something neutral as opposed to something personal. Yet it's something valuable, at least at that time of day, and it is something that she is well capable of providing. Instead of arguing with her when she asks controversial questions, he leads the conversation to his life-giving offer. He uses a common staple, water, which everyone needs daily, to drive home the point of a different kind of sustenance. We may miss these more subtle elements of the text, but they embody important pieces of who Jesus was. He respected an otherwise scorned woman, and a part of the text which we didn't read out loud this morning brings that out clearly. He had the ability to meet someone in a non-threatening way. He seemed intentional about being in the wrong place at the right time and for the right reason. We might call it willful resistance. When I think about people who find themselves on the very outer ring or on the lowest rung in our culture, it is women of color. This may surprise us or even trigger a defensive response, especially given the fact that our vice president is now a woman of color. All of us know distinguished, highly educated, successful women of color. This does not change the fact that this demographic is on the outside and has been the last to be included in a full participant in society. Black women didn't have equal status in the civil rights movement, nor did they have equal status in the women's suffrage movement. Paying attention to the dates of historical milestones is important, but also looking at when those laws were actually implemented. Listening to young Black activists dialogue on social media, as well as having personal conversation with friends, would attest to this fact, that women of color really inhabit or are forced to stay at the lowest rung. But even if new levels of participation are reached, such as is made visible through the recent election of Vice President Kamala Harris, the question surfaces, is there a difference between inclusion and belonging? Inclusion can be required legally, and inclusions have been added to the U.S. Constitution with amendments, for example. But does belonging come along with that inclusion? Inclusion can come out of a sense of obligation toward a people group. Belonging must include recognition and value of actual people. Humans being made in the image of God is what we would say. Belonging is central to Jesus' life and ministry. He embodied belonging for this woman who came to draw water at noon at a high-profile well in Samaria. My sense is that if someone was in need of belonging, Jesus would go into a territory where he didn't belong in order to find them. This shocked even his closest friends that day. This decision to defy cultural norms was not to make a scene, but to underscore this woman's humanity and to facilitate reconciliation. When this woman raises a bitter theological argument about the right place to worship, a hot button of division and derision which had long existed between Jews and Samaritans, Jesus didn't take sides, but rather he encouraged her to think beyond those two rigid options. We won't worship either where you or where we have claimed was the right place, he said. It goes far beyond what you or we have thought over generations. There seem to be two levels of belonging in this text. The question of Jesus belonging in Samaritan territory and the woman's sense of personal belonging as one who occupied one of the lowest rungs on the ladder of value in her community. Jesus entered territory where he did not belong with a mission. This time, it was to elevate this woman to a place of becoming a community leader. And it was an opportunity to give his disciples a way of seeing their own preconceived prejudices of structure, place, and decorum. As I mentioned at the outset, what has become rigid and deeply ingrained in our very DNA today has been put in place one layer, one decision, one prejudice, one turning blind eye at a time. Jesus demonstrates how to go about dismantling what seems to be indelibly etched into the core of our existence. On this final Sunday of Black History Month, but certainly not the last time we will think seriously about what it means to really be anti-racist. On today, I wonder about many things. Maybe you do too. Another statement Ta-Nehisi Coates made in the interview I referenced at the outset is this: what you saw on January 6th at the Capitol was the whitest riot you can imagine. I don't know how much of a place white people have in a world trying to heal. And here I am, a white woman, speaking to you, many of whom are white as well. What Coates said is probably right, that white people cannot be central in a world trying to heal. But I hope white people can be central in looking at the toxic systems that we have had a hand in consciously constructing or unconsciously reinforcing over the years, and to begin pulling down the structures that have suffocated not only Black and Indigenous lives, but all of us. We can do this as we continue to pray for an openness, a new way of seeing, a heart of compassion, assuming a posture of repentance, and moving out of the way enough to allow space for Black and Indigenous people to build, to belong, to breathe. Like Jesus, white people, we white people, need to take a seat and give up our position of dominance so everyone can relax to the point where no one needs to fight to protect themselves or to fight to experience justice for themselves. This is not a passive mission for us. This will require intentional, long-term, honest, and hard work. But we can do this. We are doing this. We can do this as individuals and as a community of faith as we continue to allow the life and ministry of Jesus to inform and challenge us. As white people, we can do this if we have humility to acknowledge where we have fallen short, where we have been and are still complicit in our silence, or simply comfortable because we have not needed to look at ourselves. As people of Christ, and as people of multiple ethnicities worshiping together here, we can do this as we look at our common space, the space that we share, and the space that we wish to create together to move into a more just, more forward-looking, more inviting community of belonging. May God be with us. Amen.